Hi folks, and welcome to Unit 4 on Imperialism and World War I. In video notes 1, we're going to be talking about an introduction to imperialism and what some examples of American imperialism were at this time. So we'll go ahead and get started. So some objectives, and that by the end of this set of notes, you should be able to discuss the factors that led to U.S. expansion overseas, and we'll talk about the meaning of that. You'll want to analyze the relationship between the closing of the western frontier, meaning in the continental United States, and how that kind of transitioned into expansion overseas. And then you'll need to be able to analyze the relationship between industrialization, one of our previous units, and overseas expansion. We'll kind of hit each of those. So we'll start by talking about kind of what leads into American imperialism, and that is manifest destiny in the 1840s. It was the philosophy that the United States was destined to spread from coast to coast, meaning into the western frontier, right? It was planned by God, fueled by Him as well, to expand their civilization and freedom. And this attitude fueled Western settlement and the war with Mexico there. And this image here showing buffalo skulls. And the amount of hundreds of thousands of buffaloes that were slaughtered because every buffalo dead is an Indian gone, and that it was the terrorist act against Native American Indians to kind of deplete their livelihood. So it was manifest destiny was used to justify the genocide and removal of American Indians in Western North America. But we see kind of a new use, you could say, a new use of manifest destiny, in that we were shifting from the western frontier. All right, we've been there, done that. We've gone to coast, we're good. And we're now wanting to expand overseas. And there's a few reasons, a few factors that kind of fuel that. Fear of dwindling natural resources. If you think back to industrialization, which again, that's a objective that you need to know that relationship there with the conservationist movement and the kind of response to a lot of the depletion of natural resources, we were wanting to look elsewhere for raw materials. The economic depression of the 1890s very much encouraged businesses to look overseas. And this was a huge one, in that we were looking for, the United States was looking for new markets for the products that it created in industrialization. So dwindling natural resources because of industrialization, and then the products that we were making out of industrialization, we're wanting to find new markets, all then fueled imperialism. The foreign trade became increasingly important, especially as other nations led the way in imperializing. And we're going to talk about that next, and that we weren't the only ones doing this. And we very much felt the pressure of that, all these other great powers are moving outside of their countries. So we've got to do that too. And finally, it was this superiority with manifest destiny, and that we use that same mentality of it's destined by God. And the social Darwinism sentiment that was used by industrialists now then fueled imperialism, and that we are destined to kind of go civilize these underdeveloped, uncivilized nations and bring them our ways, right? Because we're so much better. That arrogance there. So you see imperialism across the globe, and I've defined imperialism for you on the left, in that it's the policy and practice, both, of seeking to dominate both the economic and political affairs of underdeveloped areas or weaker countries. And that the United States, Germany, and you can see you've got the key down here in the bottom, Italy, the French, the Portuguese, the British, they were all imperializing. They were all taking over underdeveloped or weaker countries and dominating them. Some key terms that you want to understand for this unit, many of them we've seen, maybe not though. So a colony being a country or area under the full or partial political control of another country. And we get that, right? That's like the physical area, the country that is the colony, that is colonized. The colonized then are the people of the weaker country being taken over. And then the colonizer being the stronger country. In this case, it was us, where we just 150 or so years before were the colonized, but the stronger country that takes over the weaker one. And then maybe a new term is annex, and that meaning to take over. And you've got to understand what that is in one of our future objectives, and we'll get there. So all of this leads to overseas expansion, right? We've closed the western frontier, we've conquered that, we're good. And we have just gone through this industrialization, and that we are now needing to go outside of the continental United States. So overseas expansion being when one country takes over others, very similar to imperialism, right, that are weaker and less developed, but the idea being they economically have something to offer. And we see that as rising out of industrialization and needing somewhere else to kind of a place for those products. So at this point, you want to stop and answer the summary questions and get a stamp. And when finished, you can move on to part 2 of these notes. So we're moving right along into part 2 of the notes with a new set of objectives here, in that you need to be able to identify imperialist actions taken by the United States. So we just finished introducing what is imperialism, what did American imperialism look like. Well, now you need to have examples, and you need to know very specifics. And then 2 and 3 kind of relating back to 1, and that you've got to explain the outcome of the Spanish-American War as an imperialist action of the United States, and analyze the significance of the annexation of Hawaii, that's an important one, as well as the significance of the Spanish-American War. So those 3 objectives there. Now, you have quite a few guided readings that you're working on now, and each one of these topics, give or take like Puerto Rico and Guam, you have a guided reading that touches on these topics that I've listed here for you. But we're going to talk about Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, Philippine War with the open door policy, and the Panama Canal. So each of these being examples of American imperialism. And again, that's our objective for this note, and that you have to know these examples. And so we'll start by talking about Hawaii as one of the big examples. The significance here is, again, number 3, analyze the significance of annexation of Hawaii. The significance is that the United States was able to persuade Hawaii as a nation and the indigenous people to join the U.S. through forces other than just brute strength. And that we wanted them for a few reasons, or a couple of reasons. The big one, so our why being over here, it was a great spot for our Navy at Pearl Harbor. And we're going to talk more about Mahan and the United States Navy in the next slide. But then we also wanted them for their natural raw materials, and that we established a sugar plantation and sugar market there like no other. But the significance that we see is that there's even a staged revolution in this area, and we are able to get Hawaii to say we want to be a part of the United States because we need to avoid the tariffs of the United States. Like we're so economically dependent on the United States now, so that's a factor too, and that their market is dependent on the United States. And so to avoid the depletion completely of them, they're annexed and become a part of the United States. So kind of a sidebar here is that Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a big leader in the United States Navy, he wrote the book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890, where he kind of prophesized American imperialism, saying countries with sea power were the great nations of history. That was kind of his claim. And that the Navy was important because it defended trade routes, which we were all about at this time, right? This is why we are imperializing. And therefore also protecting or defending the colonies with those raw materials and markets that we were wanting to take advantage of. So we'll talk about Teddy Roosevelt again a little bit later, but Roosevelt takes Mahan's book and says, yeah, we need to make this happen. And he does. He even kind of says we're going to build the canal just like Mahan tells us to. So we'll touch back on this. So another example of imperialist action, and you needing to know this as an example, but also the significance of this war, is the Spanish-American War, which was in Cuba. Okay, so don't think it's in Spain. It's against the Spanish, but it's in Cuba because of the territory of Cuba that we wanted. But first, you can't talk about the Spanish-American War without talking about yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, the term comes from the color ink that they used as they started to go from just black printing. But it became known as the type of sensational and biased and often false reporting for the sake of attracting readers, and that was the priority, attracting readers and getting copies to fly off the shelves, not to be factual. So they exaggerated truths about an actual event. And the exaggerated truths in the Spanish-American War that we see in two big yellow journalism newspapers of this time is what started the Spanish-American War. So we see William Randolph Hearst in the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer in the New York World kind of competing for readers, and that's what this top cartoon up here shows, with Pulitzer on the left and Hearst on the right, and that, ooh, we've got this war that we could totally blow out of proportion. And it wasn't even a war yet, but in our blowing it out of proportion, it becomes a war. And so, and you see yellow journalism being very significant with the battleship, the United States warship, the Maine, being blown up. And we're going to talk about that more in class, kind of the significance of that battleship being blown up. So the Spanish-American War is called a splendid little war, which is kind of ironic to call a war splendid, but it was called splendid because it was short and quick, but it was also then fueled by exaggerated events and atrocities that are kind of publicized in that yellow journalism, those two publications we saw. The significance here, again, being a big objective for you, is that the United States justification of saving Cuba, because remember, the Spanish-American War is over the territory of Cuba. We're saving them, right, from a more evil world power that will inevitably conquer them anyway. So it's almost like we're blessing them. We're saving them from this evil power that's going to take them over. When in actuality, we're there because we want to use it for its coffee and sugar. We want to take it over for the raw materials that they have to offer. So again, the significance is kind of twisted there, but we see this theme in that it's all about the raw materials, the potential for the markets, and we justify it with that social Darwinism, manifest destiny, arrogance. So the Philippine War, the kind of last little war that we'll talk about, is incredibly similar. It's a more forgotten war in American history, but it was not small and it was not pretty. It was ugly because of how brutal the United States was to Filipino insurgents. And that back in the Spanish-American War, the Spaniards, with this yellow journalism piece, the atrocities, like they would corral people, civilians, into concentration camps and just execute people. It was so atrocious. And that, yes, that was happening, but we were totally not paying attention to any of the American atrocities committed in the Spanish-American War. While in the Philippine War, the United States kind of takes some of those atrocities that the Spaniards committed and uses them to their advantage. So kind of ugly there. The significance being that with the Philippines, they were thousands of miles away, right? We were able to the United States was able to very much justify taking over and helping islands that were close to the continental United States. But now this one's really far away. So there was a lot of arguing over, should we get involved? And we really go into that in your guided reading. But we eventually do, and we grant them independence, but yes, they're an independent country, but they're so completely dependent on the U.S. market and trading that we were successful. Like, sure, we don't have to worry about them anymore and like regulate them, but they can't deal without us, and that's a win-win situation for us. And then the other significance being that it was simply a stepping stone to the market in China. Again, the market being the main fuel there. So we have what's called the open door policy. This was a policy that the United States put on the Chinese market, essentially, that allowed for each foreign nation that was involved, which there were many, to trade freely in the other nation's sphere of influence. So if a country was kind of taking over the silk trade industry, other countries could still dabble in that, right? That was the open door policy. And the United States, as we have in this cartoon, we show all the other powers like Russia and Italy and France and all kinds of other people. We said, the United States comes in and says, we want to have an open door policy for all of us. This benefits everyone. So let's keep it the way it is. Well, the way it was benefited the United States. So of course we wanted to keep it the way it was. And not everybody was on board with that. Well, then we have the Boxer Rebellion, which was a group of incredibly talented and incredibly brutal Chinese who used their brutal tactics to essentially say, we hate foreign people, we hate foreign countries, and want them out of China. Well, they epically failed. But the significance being that foreign countries maintained control even though the Chinese wanted them out, and other countries like Germany and England were then really on board with the open door policy and saying, yep, let's do it because we obviously need to get control of this situation. And then Russia and other countries kind of tagged along like, all right, fine. So the last thing we'll talk about is the Panama Canal. And we're going to talk about this more as we talk about big stick diplomacy with Teddy Roosevelt in another, either in class or in a set of notes. But let's talk about what this is. So it's a 6-mile wide, that's really wide, canal zone across Colombia that connects the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This was the most celebrated accomplishment of Teddy Roosevelt in the engineering and creation of the Panama Canal. The significance here should sound familiar, how the United States got the Colombian government on board with building the canal essentially through the center of its country. And that we staged a revolution. There was a lot of domestic turmoil happening that very much threatened if we were going to be able to do this, and it was already a government that didn't want the Panama Canal as controlled by the United States. So Teddy Roosevelt was essentially able to stage a revolution and placed a government in Colombia that then backed the plans for the Panama Canal. Example of an imperialist action of the United States. Very similar to staging a revolution in Hawaii, and then kind of our dealings in Cuba as well. So at this point, you want to go ahead and stop. You're done with both part 1 and 2. Making sure you answer those summary questions and get a stamp. And remember, guys, from both your guided readings and your notes, you're wanting to understand these concepts and those objectives. That's why I give them to you, is so that we're understanding, okay, what do I need to get from this so I'm not wasting my time. So make sure that you're really investing and taking your time to understand. Everybody have a great day.